Um, I wanted to share with you, actually, in some ways, how I have started on this path. I grew up in poverty. My father was an alcoholic. My mother was an invalid. She had a stroke. She was chronically depressed. Actually tried to commit suicide many times. My family was on public assistance. Nobody in my family had gone to college. And in a situation like that as a child, you suffer greatly. And for many of us, the greatest truths come through suffering. And of course, there's no one in this room who has not, is not, or will not suffer. So how you respond to suffering, that will define how you live your life and how that life will affect others. I was fortunate, and in fact, when I was 13, I walked into a magic shop. And the owner wasn't there, but his mother was there. And she didn't know anything about magic. But after a conversation of about 20 or 30 minutes, she said, "You know, I think I can teach you something that could change your life." And at that point, I was filled with anger, despair, hopelessness. And the smile on this woman's face and this openness about her was really quite extraordinary. Maybe she's texting. But it was really quite amazing. And I wish I could tell you that I had some incredible insight at that time as to why I showed up, but I showed up because I had nothing better to do, and this was a nice person. And she told me she was in town for the next 6 weeks and wanted to meet with me every day. So I showed up, and she spent about an hour and a half or 2 hours a day with me. And she taught me actually meditation practice, combined with the visualization technique. And that was really my first experience with neuroplasticity, or changing your brain. And it's a gift, actually, that she gave me, and it's an ability that each of us has. What happened in that interaction with this woman changed how I perceived the world. I used to say that prior to this, I was like a leaf being blown by an ill wind. A view that I had few, if any, possibilities, to one where actually I had unlimited possibilities. And it was really that interaction that allowed me to have the belief that I could attend college, go to medical school, become a neurosurgeon, a professor, and actually a successful entrepreneur. In fact, I was CEO of a company that actually went public for $1.3 billion. Interestingly enough, with all that external success, there was a problem. While she taught me this and gave me this incredible gift and taught me these lessons, What took longer was to gain insight and wisdom, to understand that you cannot control everything. In fact, you can't control anything. I believed that what I wanted most was success, because that is what would make me happy. And I thought success translated into external attributes, money, and power. And that when you achieved those things, it gave you control. And once you had control, you were happy. And the reality was that I found out ultimately that that was a delusion. And the gift, another gift that was given to me, was that after having this incredible financial success, where I was living in a penthouse and driving a Ferrari and buying an island and having a villa in Florence, in 6 weeks I lost everything, to the point of being bankrupt. And when that happens, it does get your attention. But the interesting thing was, even though in some ways I was lost, I had wanted to make some contributions to charity. And I had been the CEO of this company and had a large amount of stock. So to live up to that obligation, I gave it all away, every bit. But what happened in the process of giving that away, it actually liberated me. And it liberated me because I let go of the thing that I was chasing. I no longer had an attachment to money or these other things that I thought were important. And it made me realize that the most important thing is actually to serve and care. Ultimately, that company went public, as I mentioned, and it was the gift that I gave away which actually allowed me to be in front of you today, to develop a relationship with His Holiness and to do the work that I do. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background before we start talking about some of these other things. Because every one of us in this room has a story. It's a story that, for most of us at least, has not been a straight line trajectory upward. It has been one of pain, sorrow, suffering, and to the process of that, wisdom, insights, and growth. I mentioned, or it was mentioned, that I run the center at Stanford. And one of the things that had intrigued me was the mental processes, of course, that I had gone through, but also the reality as to why people who have financial success, resources, position, see people suffering and they don't engage them. Yet we see people who have nothing who give everything. What is it about us that allows an individual who seemingly has every ability to intercede and doesn't, and in fact sometimes makes them even more selfish, isolated. It's interesting, I used to, in my youth, have resentment and anger. But one of the things that I learned is that oftentimes these people who are in these positions are suffering incredibly. The problem is, though, that until you can escape from prison, you have to know you're in prison. And for each of us to have that level of growth and to obtain wisdom, you have to appreciate your own suffering, and you have to avail yourself. You know, there's a common saying that the teacher appears when the student is ready. And that's what, unfortunately, has to come. But this interest in that paradox made me start looking at this in a more intent way. And as a result, I started working with neuroscientists and psychologists to understand this phenomena and to understand the brain and to what are the drivers of our behaviors, and also to understand are there ways we can actually change our brain. I had already had, of course, my own personal experience in this regard. So once this work began, and this actually is quite interesting, I was walking through the Stanford campus thinking about some of this research, and I said to myself, wouldn't it be wonderful to have the Dalai Lama come and speak about compassion? I am not a Buddhist. I have no connection to the Dalai Lama at that time. But this popped into my head, and what happened was, one of the things I did learn in my training was how to get things done. So I was able to arrange a meeting with the Dalai Lama. And it was an extraordinary meeting. We chatted, he asked about the work that I was doing, I explained it to him. He immediately agreed to come to Stanford. And then he began a very animated conversation with his translator. Have any of you seen his translator, Dr. Jinpa? So they began an animated conversation in Tibetan. And I was sitting there going, oh my God, did I piss off the Dalai Lama? And at the end of it, Jinpa says to me, Jim, His Holiness is so impressed with this effort that you've begun that he wants to make a personal donation. And it actually ended up being the largest donation he's ever given to a non-Tibetan cause ever. So here I go to simply ask him to come and visit, and he gives me this incredible gift, which then turns into this incredible sense of responsibility. Damn that guy. But it turned into really a wonderful joy. And in fact, Dr. Jinpa, who actually lives in Montreal, and he's a former monk and got a PhD at Cambridge. For 3 years, he spent a month with me at Stanford developing the center and doing this work, and actually has become a very dear friend. So let's talk about neuroscience a little bit. And I think, though, we have to have a conversation about the evolution of our species, about altruism, if you will, or compassion within animals. And that will set us on the stage to understand a little bit about the effect of certain types of contemplative practices on our brains and how it can have, or they can have, a profound effect and actually give us the gift of what each of us, I think, wants the most, which is transcendence. And that is that state where you understand your purpose, your place, and also recognize that we are all one. So if you look at the evolution of our species, some people have quoted Darwin as saying it's the survival of the fittest. And in fact, this statement was never made by Darwin. He actually said it's the survival of the most sympathetic, meaning the most kind. And in fact, research has shown that while ruthlessness on the short term results in advantage, on the long term, a species cannot survive unless there is cooperation. And that is true in primates, it's true in a variety of other species, and ultimately that cooperation and kindness will determine whether our own species survives. We are separated from other primates, and I won't say we are a superior species because we are the only species that with intention kills people or others of our own species for no reason. But we are separated from other species because we have something called theory of mind. We have the ability to think abstractly, and we have complex language. That resulted in significant enlargement of our cortex, and as a result, decreased the size of our litters, increased the size or the length of the gestational period, and also resulted in a requirement that our offspring are cared for 15 years outside of the womb, in my case apparently 30 years. And the reason is that unlike other offspring who just run away and the mother and father are quite happy, they're gone immediately, and that offspring has been given tools for their survival, the human species has to learn from its parents. And there is a huge cost to the parent in this interaction, or to the mother. It is incredibly costly in terms of energy, time, effort to care for a child, as many of you in this room know. So evolution required these incredibly strong bonds to connect the mother with the child. And this is manifested in one of the pathways, at least, with the release of something called oxytocin, which is a small peptide. It has been called in the popular press the love, nurturing, or bonding hormone. That, as well as other neural pathways, results in a reward being given as someone cares, a mother cares for the child and attaches her to that child very strongly. And that is responsible for our survival as a species. It is that connection, that ability to read the emotions or the needs of a child instantaneously. And as we evolve from the nuclear family, if you will, to the hunter-gatherer tribes or groups. And remember, hunter-gatherer tribes were the primary survival strategy for humans until 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. I mean, Isn't that extraordinary? I mean, that's a blink in time. And amazingly, our DNA has not changed from 200,000 years ago. So we still are like our species were 200,000 years ago. But here's the problem. We are highly attuned to patterns, to movement, and we have a mechanism or a part of our brain called the amygdala, which is associated with what we call our flight or fight response, or our stress response. When we sense danger, as an example out in your peripheral field, if you were on the savannah in Africa and you saw a lion move, all these physiologic processes would engage, and then your muscles would be given more blood, your pupils would dilate, you would have this release of epinephrine and norepinephrine, you'd have the release of cortisol, you would run, and one of two things would happen. What were they? You would either live or you would die. If you lived, those hormones immediately came down to normal level, and you were ready to go again, to be focused on eating, shelter, and reproduction. That is the way it was. In our modern society, those same mechanisms to respond are turned on because we have so many distractions that it puts this system at a hypervigilant state. And many of us are chronically releasing these hormones that are associated with this flight or fight response. And we know that when they're chronically released, even at low levels, it has a huge, huge effect on our health. And in fact, we have learned that many of the disease states that we are afflicted with are associated with inflammation, which occurs as a result of these stressor hormones. So we have, on the one hand, this stress response, and then on the other hand, we have something that is called the relaxation response. And this translates into the two sides of our autonomic nervous system. And that is essentially how we are balanced to function in this world as humans. One is the survival mode, and the other is this mode of openness, caring, nurturing, being present. It's interesting that when monks were first being studied, about 3 decades ago, the scientists, the tool that they were using to study was electroencephalography. And have any of you seen the cap that they, or it has all these electrodes, you see this monk sitting there with it. Well, when this was first presented to the monks, they were told that they were going to be studying compassion. Okay? And the scientist is in front of them demonstrating the use of this cap, and they all started laughing. Now, the scientists thought it was because this cap looked funny, but one of the monks educated him by telling him, why would you put this on your head when compassion comes from your heart? And in many ways, there is great truth to that. And the truth is that there are an immense number of neural connections between your brain and your heart. As an example, one of the greatest causes of sudden cardiac death is secondary to something called a lack of heart rate variability. There's also a syndrome that was first described in Japan called the broken heart syndrome, where people have a heart attack when they have a loss of a loved one. So there is this great connection there. The other thing that has happened, and it certainly is interesting, isn't it, where scientists have gone to the East to try to understand and document well-known realities that have been well-known for thousands of years, and now to somehow prove them. Now, of course, the sad thing, though, is that we have so many people from the East, from third world countries oftentimes, places where they have the greatest wisdom, traditions, and insights that have allowed them to develop these incredible mental states to actually control their physiology and live happy, and they want to immigrate to a place where we have the highest levels of anxiety, stress, and depression. I mean, so they are sacrificing this incredible gift to come to a place of what they unfortunately perceive as better, and in fact, they pay an extraordinary price for that. In fact, if you survey people, 25% of people in the West will tell you that when they are lonely, in pain, or suffering, they have no one to go to. 25% of people. It is also a reality in the West that you can share a cubicle for years and know nothing about the person who is next to you. Now, how does this contrast with the hunter-gatherer tribe? How does it contrast with what we were made for and our abilities? In the hunter-gatherer tribe, you knew everyone, and you also had this ability to read people's emotional states. This is the holdover that you had from the development of the parental bond, where you had to see a child was in pain. In the hunter-gatherer tribe, if you were not able to read another person's emotional state and respond to their suffering, to alleviate that suffering, you put the tribe at risk. So you had to have that. But remember, this was your tribe. And in modern society, most people do not live in the same village. They don't have their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their children, all living within close proximity. They don't have a sense of true community. And as a result, you have situations where I described where you could have a person who is suffering deeply, working next to you, and every morning you say, hello, how are you? And they look at you and say, I'm fine. And in fact, they're not fine at all. And in fact, this happens to each of us too. I mean, how many of you authentically answer the question if somebody says to you, how are you doing? I mean, how many of you said, they go, you know, I had a shitty day, and you know, I really need to talk to somebody because I just don't feel right. How often do you really get the opportunity to do that? Most people don't. And that lies part of the problem. So let's talk about meditation practice. We know that we can change the brain through mental training. There are a variety of practices, and the challenge for scientists is they're not all Buddhists per se, nor do they translate Buddhist practice directly into a scientific paradigm. And by that I mean, if you look at traditional definitions of mindfulness from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, there are two components that, if you will, are the two wings of this bird, and they are wisdom and compassion. Yet, oftentimes, mindfulness practice doesn't focus enough on that, and what can happen is that this practice is an incredible way to obtain attention, focus, and to have non-judgmental awareness. And it allows you to be present. And it has these positive physiologic effects in that it can decrease your emotional reactivity. And because you have emotional reactivity, because you were responding to the dialogue in your head, if you are able to not be distracted and have that emotional reactivity, then your blood pressure goes down and you're not distracted, and oftentimes you feel more calm. But we are seeing now with compassion meditation, which would include the first two parts of the four immeasurables, loving kindness meditation, ultimately translating into compassion and the recognition of the suffering of another, that it can have very profound effects on our physiology. How does this work? When we see another in distress, we have to make a determination immediately. And that determination is processed in the same area where we have our flight or fight mechanism. We have to determine if the recognition of another suffering does what? If we were to see that, we have to determine, is that going to put me at risk? Am I safe? Should I run away? And when you practice a loving kindness or compassion meditation, it makes you much more open to process this event with intent versus just running away. So then once you engage, what has to happen? You then have to bring in memories of potentially past interactions from other parts of your brain. You have to bring in the mental aspect of am I going to act, which stimulates your pre-motor cortex. And then you ultimately have to act. Now, we define compassion as a recognition of another's suffering with a desire to alleviate that suffering. So sometimes you cannot always intervene. But when you act compassionately, we know that if you look at the metabolism in the pleasure centers of the brain, that they actually activate. You know, your pleasure centers in your brain, your cingulate, your caudate, they actually respond to pleasure. This is where if you take actually stimulant drugs, you can have an increased metabolism, sex, food, money. But amazingly, when you are compassionate, these same areas light up. And you receive pleasure from being compassionate. And what's interesting is that we see in experienced meditators of compassion meditation, or compassion practice, that their brains are so attuned to the emotional states of others. As an example, they did an experiment where they used sounds of distress, and then they looked at novice meditators and expert meditators, that the expert meditators actually very deeply responded to the suffering of another, and that they could synchronize their brains to have what we call gamma synchrony, which is associated with a higher mental state, and that the novice meditators do not. And it is in this higher state that they are superbly and supremely attuned to that which is around them and are able to process that and be aware of it. And in fact, have you heard of Mathieu Ricard? So Mathieu's a good friend of mine. So it's interesting, they did a study with him at the University of Wisconsin, and he could actually parse out this. If they said, show empathy at 25%, he could actually be pretty close. And you could say, okay, now bring it up to 50%. And he could actually do that, which is an extraordinary mind control. The interesting thing about that, though, if you ask him to maintain this state, he would say it was one of the most painful things, because you were taking on the suffering of another, and if you don't get release from some action, you were sitting there living the same pain. And this is the problem with some people who are so empathetic that they immediately take on the suffering of another and can deeply feel that other person's pain. And then from there, it goes through these other processes, and you can actually monitor these different places to the point where you give compassion, and then you see this incredible increase in blood flow to the pleasure centers. We know that meditation practice like this can create this state, but the question is, can it create the trait where there is a prolonged effect of these types of behaviors? And we are seeing that, in fact, it does happen. All of you have experienced the situation where someone walks in a room, they enter with a sense of calmness, openness, kindness. And what happens when that type of a person walks in a room? Everybody relaxes, they feel calm. And then you also know what happens when a twit walks into the room. It changes everything. And when you practice compassion meditation, where you are authentic, where you walk into a place with an open heart, where you have developed this trait of being kind to yourself, being kind to not only those you care about, but strangers, and even people you dislike. You're able to walk in the world with an openness that affects everyone around you. And this has been shown scientifically to be one of the benefits of this type of a practice, and it turns it from a state of mind to a thing that you carry with you in all of your interactions. And it's an extraordinary gift that is available to each of us. But it's like a muscle, and what has to happen with a muscle? You have to go to the gym. And I can tell you that early on, going to the gym is really hard, isn't it? But once you've been there a lot, you also learn that you can, the more you go, the easier it is, and you don't necessarily need the hour workout. It can translate into a shorter period of time. But the other aspect is that when you live in this state, your whole being is constantly giving gifts to other people. We also, and it has been shown, that when you do these actions with intent, it has an effect on those around you, and they are much, much more likely to show care and compassion to others. With the exception of Switzerland, if you go around and smile, people smile back at you. I say Switzerland because, have any of you been to Switzerland? Have you noticed this? When you walk around Switzerland, people go, and if you smile at them, they think you want something from them. Right? And of course, it's a cultural thing, and I was talking to a fellow from Switzerland about that today, and we were sort of joking about that. But, in general, if you walk around with openness and a smile, it affects every interaction you have with people. And it's shown to be true. The other side benefits of these types of practices is, I talked about this hypervigilant state, this chronic release of these deleterious hormones. With an 8-week training program, and this is the work of Barbara Fredrickson and Steve Cole, and work that we have done as well as the group at Emory, with a type of loving kindness or compassion practice of simply 8 weeks duration, you can actually see ongoing benefit for months and months to years afterward in terms of their physiologic state. We know that these chronic release of these hormones are diminished. We know that there are genetic or epigenetic phenomena that occur. Like, as an example, if I were to sit here for simply 15 minutes with intent, concentrating on caring, kindness to others, it will have an effect on my genetic release of certain inflammatory markers, such that it will significantly decrease them. It is almost actually instantaneous. The other thing that it does is it has a significant effect on your peripheral physiology in terms of lowering your blood pressure, and in fact even actually how those cells are created and we already talked about its effect on your heart. The other component is that there's increasing evidence that these types of practices actually affect the length of your telomeres, which is associated with length of life. And to show you how powerful this is in the context of caring and service, which is what oftentimes compassion translates into, there was a study done on women over the age of 65 who did a certain number of volunteer hours, and each week, and it compared them to people who did not do any. And the people who did this minimum number of volunteer hours had up to a 2x increase in longevity compared to those who did not. And this shows you the power of connection, of caring for others, because it is an innate part of our DNA, and when we do these acts, physiologically, we function better. The interesting thing about that study is, within that group of volunteers, there were some people who did not get this benefit. And it was associated with them doing it because they wanted recognition or benefit. You see, you have to care without attachment to an outcome or a benefit. And this is really the basis of loving kindness meditation, is to want happiness, fulfillment for everyone, but you don't need to have attachment to that. It's like love, right? If you love someone, oftentimes you are moved by how they respond to you, their reaction to you. But when you care to really receive the benefit, you have to do it with no expectation. And that's the greatest gift you can learn, is to give with no expectation, no attachment. And when you're able to do that, suddenly, because you do not have that expectation, but it is an innate part of how you function, everyone gives to you, which is an extraordinary thing, right? When you expect nothing, you are given everything. And it's really one of the wonderful benefits of this type of a practice. So when we think about these practices, of course, we recognize that these are at the basis of many traditions, certainly Buddhism. But we also know you don't have to be a Buddhist at all to practice these and to receive the benefit from them. I just thought I would open this up to see if you had any particular questions or thoughts about some of these things. Anybody?
Do you have any experience trying to dealing with a psychopathic mind? And is it possible for them to train this way, or they just wouldn't want to because they're psychopathic in the first place?
Well, that's a really good question. If we look at the expression of compassion in society, if you will, or a compassionate personality, like all things, there's a bell-shaped curve, right? So on the one hand, you have people like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, or Desmond Tutu, or Nelson Mandela. These people who just express kindness, compassion, that's an innate part of their being, and potentially it's just they're born that way. So there's a subset of people who have this set of genetic aspects that make them incredibly compassionate. Then you have, at the other extreme, the psychopaths or sociopaths, the Wall Street bankers. have very little compassion. That is a group of people who we know that they do not have the ability, no matter how much time you take with them, to change at all. It's just not possible. And in fact, it is now shown that even as young as 4 and 5, based on certain types of behaviors, you can, with a high degree of success, identify children who are going to be sociopaths. And it's not because these children are raised incorrectly oftentimes, although brutal life experience can make somebody extraordinarily insensitive. But that's different. I'm talking about true sociopaths. You cannot change them. And in fact, it begs the question, if that is the case, are these people really responsible for their actions? Because if you do not have the capacity to respond to others' emotional states, and is it really your fault if you kill people or do these other things? And I'm not trying to justify this behavior, but I think it's worth thinking through. In fact, it's probably the worst handicap or disability, right? But beyond that group over here, I believe that there are people who, and I think science actually has borne this out, similar to what we have learned with happiness, is that we have a genetic predisposition, but none of us are at the max of what our ability is. So with these types of training, you can actually max your ability to be compassionate and receive all the benefit, which is this constant sense of elation at your ability to serve and connect, and really receive the joy of that, and ultimately receive a deep level of happiness and purpose that actually can give you. To give an example of some of the genetic aspects of this and how powerful it is, do you guys know what a vole is? A V-O-L-E?
A little creature.
It's a little creature, that's right. It's a rodent, and they're different types. One's a prairie vole, one's a meadow vole. But the prairie voles actually, the male and the female, it is a monogamous relationship. The male actually engages in caring for the offspring. But the meadow vole guy is a promiscuous guy. He doesn't stay with a partner. He doesn't participate in the raising. And it has been shown that this is actually due to the amount of oxytocin receptors in part as to why they're not as engaged or as caring or as nurturing. And again, you could sit there, well then, is it really the fault of the meadow vole that he's a philanderer? And in fact, they were able to insert more receptors into the meadow vole, and he became a wonderful example of a father and husband. And I know some of the women here going, oh, well, we should do that too. So it shows you the genetic aspect of these types of behaviors. And in fact, we know that there was a study done that measured certain receptors, or oxytocin receptors, and if you have the GG receptor, you are actually much more pro-social, much more connected, versus if you have the AG or the AA receptor. This is in humans, right? So on some level, our capacity for empathy and compassion is genetically determined. But again, we do have the ability with practice to set the thermostat, if you will, a little warmer, to be more compassionate and receive the benefit of those types of behaviors. Is there another question? Yes, ma'am.
You were talking of Matthew Rico and his, when he was feeling high levels of compassion, that he could feel the pain.
Empathy.
Okay, empathy. Thank you. That's good to distinguish. How does he deal? How did he deal? Does he deal with that feeling of pain? What does he do to transmute, or does he, or what happens?
Well, you have to remember this was in the context of a study. It's
Yeah.
like, you're doing a study and you're putting your hand over the fire. Well, you don't normally stay at that state ever. What he was doing with specific direction was to be in that empathic state. But that's not a natural state, and that's not a state he would choose, because for most of us, it would simply immediately go off into recognizing another's suffering, and then move to correlate it with these other memories and our sort of planning in our frontal areas to then do something which stimulates our motor cortex, and then we intervene and we get the positive effect of seeing the alleviation of that suffering. You see, so it's not as if he's just sitting there suffering, because that would be very.
Well, I mean, personally, the reason that I ask that question is I work as a counsellor, and there are times when I can feel bombarded with that discomfort, with that energy, and sometimes it can be challenging to work with it.
No, you're absolutely correct, and I think you're talking about, they call it compassion fatigue, but in fact it's empathic fatigue, isn't it? Right?
There's a difference perhaps between, or I've begun to understand the difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy, where you actually feel the pain of another. Compassion is, I don't know how to define it.
Well, compassion is the recognition of that suffering with the desire to alleviate the suffering. Now, you have to remember, though, empathy is not necessarily only associated with suffering.
Sure.
You can have empathetic joy, right, which is one of the four measurables. You can connect with somebody and be joyous with them. You can be in awe with them. You can be happy with them. That's all empathy. It's just the type you're talking about is very difficult, and this is one of the problems with care providers, right? You see people and they're in such pain, and it puts you in pain, especially when you do not have tools or the ability to alleviate that suffering, and then it becomes very painful. And one of the challenges is to be able to set boundaries and not get lost in those emotions. And that can be extraordinarily difficult.
More meditation.
Yeah, and sometimes that's not enough. Meditation's not the answer for everything. It's interesting. We see Time magazine and we see everything saying the mindfulness revolution. And while there's ever increasing interest in this, that's not necessarily the answer for everything. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry.
Oh,
It's okay, go ahead.
we have plenty of time.
I just go back to your early point, the paradox between the person that has so much that can't seem to give and the person that has nothing but can give. And just in my work, I've learned over the years that sometimes when children are raised as being the best, or number one, or the greatest, or the favourite, I guess the difficulty occurs that they can become, they are just the best, but if they're not, they then become nothing, and that's a real vulnerability for them. And I wondered in that group of people if being the best is having the most, and if you have a whole lot of money and you are raised as the best, if you give a little bit away, then the fear is that you become nothing because you haven't got the most anymore. But the people with nothing who can give, they gain something by giving. So they grow, whereas at the other extreme, it's just, part of
Well, there's work by a guy named Michael Krauss, and one aspect is that when you don't need others, your ability to read emotional states is decreased. Because most of us live our lives where how we function in our lives is dependent on how people treat us, right? And therefore, we have to be nice to people to get them to be nice to us. That's just reality. If you have no need of other people to get everything that you want, it doesn't matter how they feel. It doesn't matter if you're stepping on them. It doesn't matter if you're ignoring them. It doesn't matter if you're mean to them, because it never impacts on you getting what you want. And this is one of the problems. The other problem is that in people typically who are poor, they have suffered deeply. You see, they have experienced wanting. They have experienced pain. They have experienced suffering. They know at a very deep level how it feels to be in that position. And when you know exactly how it feels, then it's much easier when you see that in someone to offer, because you know how it feels. And you don't want them to suffer the same way you have suffered. The challenge sometimes with the more affluent or the higher socioeconomic class is that if someone has always had everything, then they don't understand these other people's emotional states. If they grew up with nothing and then got everything, sometimes you see people who are even more antagonistic or mean to poor people because there is a certain amount of shame associated with that, and they want to distance themselves from that. And they also want to sit there and say, I made it, and I made it because I had the special attribute, and you are inferior, and I don't want to associate with that. The sad thing, of course, is those people are carrying a certain amount of pain. And it's interesting because I'm not sure, I'll say I have the opportunity frequently to interact with people, some extraordinarily wealthy people. And some of them, it's so sad to see how they're suffering. And you know, many people say, oh, God, it'd be so great to have the private jet. It would be so great to live wherever I want. But the price sometimes you pay for that, because what happens to these people? First of all, oftentimes they're always in fear about all the people interacting with them and why they're interacting with them, right? They have no ability to know who is sincerely cares about them and who doesn't. So a lot of them live these lives which appear to be incredibly wonderful, but in fact are miserable, and they're always uncertain. And then they translate this material prosperity into holding on even tighter because they think everybody wants to take it from them.
And sometimes then if they lose that, the money, they become...
Well, that's their identity, right?
Yeah, they're nothing.
Because that's how they control things around them. That's how they control their world. Yeah. And it's really, it's very sad. I have been in a situation, I'll give you one example, where a person comes to me and says, I think your work is fascinating. And she's an extraordinarily wealthy woman. And she, her purse that she's carried is $25,000. And, she flies to the Hamptons in a private jet. You can get the flavor of it. So she says, I would really like you to come out to New York, where she lives, and, meet with some of my friends and discuss your work, and because I'm just so excited about this and I want to be supportive, which is sort of wonderful, right? So I fly out to New York, and I go to her home for this event, which is a 7-story brownstone in the upper 60s on the east side. And, you know, the home itself is probably 30 or 40 million. The contents are similar. So we have this event with her friends. And so at the end of it, she says, you know, God, I'm just so excited about this, da-da-da-da-da. I want to give you a gift, and it'll be the largest gift my husband and ever I have given to anything. Okay, I go, oh my God, this is incredible. I mean, I'm going to have the best center in the world, da-da-da-da-da. And it was the value of her purse was her gift. Right? The largest gift she'd give it to anyone. And now, I guess I am thankful she gave a gift, but it's extraordinary, right? The lack of insight, because that is essentially equivalent to what most of us would consider change in our pocket, right? And you know, I mean, if somebody said, well, I'm giving you the change in my pocket today, and to build this great center you're doing this, and but it shows you a complete disconnect between their perception of what giving is and their worth. There's another woman who easily is worth $2 billion, who actually is involved in sort of this arena. And she is the least giver on this board that she's on, of all the people on the board, to the tune of the amounts we're talking about. And again, not insignificant, but by exponentially she has more than all the other board members, yet she gives the least of any of the board members. And you sit there and you just go, but she has no perception. If you ask her, do you feel you're rich? Oh, no, no. I mean, it is the most amazing thing in the world. It's an interesting type of psychology. But again, it is delusion, right? You know, the challenge for all of us is how do we not live in a delusional state? And unfortunately, oftentimes when you have everything, who do you surround yourself with? You surround yourself with people like you, and you surround yourself with people who agree with you. Right? And the people you hire agree with you because at some level they're paid to agree with you. And I think the challenge is, what I prefer to do is I prefer to have people around me who are much smarter than me and who will completely disagree with me and argue about that disagreement, because those types of people keep you honest and you don't get lost. This is the problem with celebrities, right? Because it's called situational narcissism. You know, when everybody tells you you're great, you go, well, I guess I am great because everybody tells me I'm great. Right? And nothing can be further from the truth, oftentimes. Yes, sir.
On a related matter, I know there is a movement to try and bring compassion to the business community through courses and outreach and so on. Could you say something about how that's going and how it's being received?
Actually, I was just at a global mindful leadership forum, which that was its intent. And I think what we have seen, based on a lot of the scientific work that I was just talking about, that there is extraordinarily great interest in this. Now, there's great interest in a couple of ways. One is the method by which a capitalist society rewards its leaders creates a group of people who are more ruthless and self-serving, so that's a problem. But what do we know? We know that in the US, $200 to $300 billion a year is lost from lack of productivity associated with stress, anxiety, and depression. and associated mind-body disconnects like gastrointestinal problems, headache, low back pain, that are all related to an environment, if you will, that is not compassionate. The interesting thing is a number of studies have now been done that show that when a company with intent practices compassion, and I'll explain what that means, there is a significant increase in share price, productivity, and, if you will, overall success of a company in terms of decreased healthcare costs and decreased human resources costs. And that data is now only really getting out there. So you have people who are interested in this, one, who are sort of still the ruthless types, but they see that this affects the return on investment, and they do it, and they have no interest in it. Right. And then you see the other people who say, I have been engaged in these types of practices, and it's had a profound effect on me personally, and I understand how it can have an effect on an organization. And in fact, just at this event I was at, there was a head of an energy company whose name I can't remember at the moment, but he's a very successful CEO in a very large energy company, and he actually said his path was as follows: to change things. Have you ever, any of you know what a 360 evaluation is? It's in the corporate world, and you know, they look at things from people below you, above you, et cetera. And the company that had done this survey on this organization said his report was the absolute most abominable worst they had ever seen. Right? And of course, when you get told that, what do? You deny that it's fair and that there was a jerk doing it and there was a problem with the study and it possibly couldn't be corrected. And he said, but then I went to my wife and I told her about this, and she said, well, they're exactly right, you're an asshole. And she said, I've been telling you that for 20 years. And the interesting thing is, though, that what he did was, which actually you have to honor and respect this fellow, he published this publicly in the newsletter to everyone. And he said, will you help me? Which is incredible insight, right? And so he actually got into Buddhism and a practice, and it changed everything around. And so he's imbued the entire organization, and it's had a huge impact on the organization, where I think, if I recall his statistic, they were in the lower quadrant, this company who was running, and they went up to the highest quadrant with the most profitability. All because he changed how he viewed the world. And this is, an example is as follows. You know, two people can walk out to the rain and have completely different experiences, right? One guy can walk out and say, God, thank God for the rain. The plants are going to grow. We've been in a drought. The water on my face is just, oh, it feels so good. It reminds me I'm alive. What a great day. And you have another guy walk out and he goes, God damn it, it's raining. There's gonna be tons of traffic. My new suit is wet. This is just like everything else in my life. Yet they both experienced the exact same thing. So the issue isn't the external events. What is the issue? It's how you respond to the external events. And your ability to respond in a manner which is of benefit to you is up to you. And it's a choice you make, and it's one with practice you can try to look at the upside of every interaction. So this person really changed everything. And what are the components, if you will, of a company that, if you will, practices compassion. One is you have to, and this is life in general, or in organizations at any time, you have to have people not be afraid. Okay? Because when people are afraid or fearful, it results in this area of your brain called your executive control, which is associated with planning, creativity, productivity, to not function at its best. So you have to create an environment where there is not fear. I mean, and I'm sure some of you experience this. You go to work and you're worried whether your boss is going to be a jerk that day, whether you're going to be fired. Well, if you have this uncertainty all the time, how can you not be but in fear? So you have to create an environment where you diminish that fear. And how do you create that? One, there has to be an environment of trust and respect. And communication, open communication, where you firmly believe, and it is in fact reality, that, well, your comments or communication may ultimately not have the desired effect you wish. You do know, though, that you were truly listened to. It's not so much that somebody agrees with you, it's that they, in fact, care enough to listen to you. And that is recognizing your dignity as a human being and showing respect for you. The other thing is that in life, in our jobs, there is stress that is good stress. And good stress allows us to be productive, to be creative, to be excited, to be challenged. It is not chronic. It is not overwhelming. It does not create fear. Excessive stress, though, makes you feel overwhelmed and, again, fearful. Also, when you have stress and you feel you have no control, so you have to be in a place where you have a sense that, again, as I told you earlier, none of us have any real control, but at least in the context of the job you're doing, you have certain responsibilities where you can be engaged and feel that you are contributing, and it is your choice to make certain decisions within that. So having that control. And then the other thing that's critically important within a corporate entity is that in your job, you have a sense of mission and purpose. You know, as a neurosurgeon, mine's pretty easy. Or as a healthcare provider. But you know, if you're in a company where you make a widget that sticks in some machine and you don't even know what the machine does, it's sort of hard to get excited about that, right? Mm-hmm. But if you change the paradigm slightly to say, you know, my company is so wonderful because when we create this widget, it has an impact here, but also that we take part of the profits to do good in our community or to allow us to do volunteerism. It then changes where now you have a sense of purpose that what you're doing is meaningful because it has all these other aspects. And then, of course, there has to be authentic communication. Everyone understands in a business environment that sometimes decisions have to be made that are not good in the sense that people get fired or laid off. But what's the difference between the CEO coming out and saying, listen, we've had a bad quarter or year. Unfortunately, I've had to make the decision to terminate some of you, but I want you to know I'm sorry this has had to happen. I want you to know that we're going to give you X amount of pay. I want you to know that we're going to have people who are going to work with you to try to find you other positions because we care and appreciate your contribution, versus you come into your desk in the morning, there's an envelope, and you open it, and there's your termination check, and a note that says your services are no longer needed, please empty your desk, goodbye. I mean, what's the difference there, right? And isn't it amazing though, because each of us sits here, when I talk about this, we go, well, of course that should be the way it is. But why isn't it that way? And it's because oftentimes people don't think with intent. And this is, I think, one of the lessons. And this practice I mentioned earlier, to set forth your intention has a huge impact on how the rest of the things are going to play out. So if as a boss in a company, if you think your intention every day is, how do I serve my employees? How do I serve my shareholders? Right? Like, I'll give you an example. I always tell my residents and medical students, here's how you tell a good doctor. When he walks on the floor, if he sees the orderly who changes the bedpans and acknowledges him and thanks him, if he sees the people sweeping the floors and acknowledges and thanks them, if he knows the names of these people, he knows the nurses, at every step of the way he shows gratitude because he recognizes that he cannot do his job without every one of those people, and that they are a critical component of that person's success. Well, what happens? People will bend over backwards for you. I'll give you an example. I had left Stanford at one time, actually to help a rural hospital in southern Mississippi, because they'd asked me to come out as a consultant, and I felt so bad for their situation that, and I presented how to solve their problem. They had no neurosurgery, no neurology, no orthopedics, no physical medicine, rehab. I mean, it was just a disaster. And they said, can you help solve this problem? And I said, well, here's how you do it. And I said, it will cost this much. And they said, well, okay, here's the money, will you do it? And I went, oh. So I did agree to do it. And it turned into a remarkable success. It changed a sense of, geez, we want a body to cover our emergency room, and this is our need, to we're developing a program that is going to be a resource for our entire community, and it's going to be a center of excellence. Those are two different ways to look at the world. But I had to leave because my wife refused to live in rural Mississippi following Hurricane Katrina. And so I stayed for 2 years after that because I felt it meant. But the rest of the story is as follows. So I recruited somebody to take my place. Now, getting a highly qualified neurosurgeon to come down to rural Mississippi actually is a challenge, as it turns out. So I get this guy who comes down, and on paper he not only had good qualifications. So we walk into the hospital for me to give him a tour. So we go to the information desk, which is present at every hospital. The woman at the information says, Dr. Doty, it's so great to see you. God, I'm going to miss you so much. And she comes around and gives me a hug. We then go to the cafeteria. And the woman behind the cafeteria goes, oh, Dr. Doty, let me get that latte for you. And I think we have one of those croissants you like. So we sit down and do it. Then we go to radiology, and there's a technician there who just had a baby. And, I made the effort to know that, right? I mean, she's pregnant and she's got to have a baby. So I bring her a gift. Right? And so she comes and she goes, Dr. Doty, thank you so much for that gift for the baby. He's playing with it, da-da-da-da-da. And she says, can I give you a hug? So then we go, and so basically this is how this plays out the rest of the day, for the hour and a half. So we finished this, and I said, well, what do you think? And he goes, what the fuck just happened? and I go, what are you talking about? He goes, what's wrong with those people? Now, can you imagine that somebody has this perspective? And I go, my own experience has been, if you treat people with dignity, respect and you authentically show you care, you cannot pay them enough for what they will do for you. I said, how do you perceive leadership and sort of being in charge of a team? He says, well, I'm in charge and I tell them where to ship and they say how much. I said, well, that's really been an effective strategy since you're looking for a job. And, and I didn't give him the job. But could you imagine that type of perspective of how you see? And again, what did it cost me to simply be nice? Nothing. In fact, it's a joy. I mean, to wake up and be able to be of service to people and to engage them and to acknowledge that what they're doing is so important, which it is, because what do all of us want? All of us want to have people look at our best sides of us and say, I care. Right? It's funny, when I got to this compassion business, I guess, I would have people come to and listen, I'm a neurosurgeon. I'm supposed to be a brusque, arrogant, rude. You got it? Yeah. But I would get these people, they would come to my office and they'd make an appointment to see me, but it had nothing to do with the medical program. They just wanted to see me. And it was fascinating, though, because they would come and what they would want, and these were people who had suffered, they would want to tell their story with its trials and tribulations, and then they would want you to say, I appreciate what you've been through. I appreciate your suffering. I acknowledge that you have been able to overcome this, and you've done an incredible job for your situation, and you should pat yourself on the back, and you're on the right path. And invariably, they just burst into tears. And then I have to hug them. and I sit there and hug them, and they're crying. And I'm going, oh my God. And then they go, oh, thank you so much, thank you so much. And then they leave. And it's the most interesting thing, this phenomenon, right? It would be so funny because my staff starts saying, well, there goes another one. And I finally, though, had to stop because, to sit with somebody for an hour and go through this is so taxing and draining. And I mean, I would be doing that. I'm a neurosurgeon. My job is to be a neurosurgeon. But I do understand that. But my point to you is, this is what everyone wants. And this is the gift that you can give people. Your presence. Being present for someone. Authentically listening. Some of you may be fans of Thich Nhat Hanh. So I was with him and we were having a conversation. And this is what we talked about this. Listening, compassionate listening, being present, embracing, openness, non-judgmental conversation. It has a profound, profound effect. One of the joys that I have in what I do, and we have a website, I don't know if any of you have seen it, but if you look up CCARE, CCARE.stanford.edu, there are three parts to what we do. One is just pure research. One is we have interventions, one of which is this compassion and cultivation training. I call it mindfulness plus C, because it teaches you attention and focus and non-judgmental self-awareness, but it very intently focuses on compassion. And I think it makes it very powerful, and it has within the studies we have done. Then we have another part, which is we put on the Science of Compassion Conference, which is an academic conference for those who study compassion, altruism, and empathy. And we have a lecture series where we bring prominent scientists from around the world, and we tape all of these. All of this is on our website. And then we have workshop seminars, and we also have a summer research institute for graduate and postdoctoral students where they come for a week and interact with the leading scientists in this area. But one of the things I enjoy most, if not the thing I enjoy most about this, is I do a thing called Conversations on Compassion. And have any of you seen Charlie Rose? I don't know if he's popular down here, but this is an interviewer who sits on a stage with somebody, one person, for about an hour and a half. So I do this Charlie Rose type of thing where I sit on a stage for an hour and a half and I just chat with people who I think are interesting. And what I'm really interested in is sort of what their backstory is, what drove, because all of us have a backstory, right? It motivates us to do what we do, as an example, to be here tonight. And so I would encourage you to maybe watch some of these, because I've had Thich Nhat Hanh, Eckhart Tolle, and some of these are just hilarious conversations. Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Sadhguru, do any of you know these people? Amma, the hugging guru. And as well as very prominent scientists and stuff like this. But again, one of the joys that I have is I get to spend time with some of the most incredible spiritual leaders, and it's just extraordinary how you see the profound effect of having an open heart and just embracing you with this, and how it makes you feel that way and how you want to spread that as well. You know, I'll tell you two other stories real quick. I had not met Amma before, and do you guys all know who she is? Extraordinary woman. She's fourth grade education, came from dire poverty, and runs this really multi-billion-dollar charity, and she does service throughout the world, and she's revolutionized Carroll Estate, and there's universities that she started, and educational centers, and technical schools. There's a school of medicine, and staffed at the highest level with very well-trained Westerners and non-Westerners. Anyway, I was at an event, and I was talking to a reporter from India, and I had said, you know, it's interesting, Amma always fascinates me. I just don't, because what makes people follow people, right? And she said, I haven't ever done an interview with her. I said, I would love to do it, because I just like to understand this. So this is on a Sunday, and a Thursday, she texts me this report. She goes, met Amma's representative. Amma wants to meet you. You need to be here Thursday, 5 o'clock. I thought, wow. And it turned out that Amma was in Northern California. She has an ashram there. Happened to be in town. This reporter was at a tech company where some of her people ended up being, told her about me, and so I got invited to this event with Amma. So they put me in the second row in the middle, right in front of her, and this reporter. And 2.5 hours of chanting, all of this stuff. And I'm watching it, I go, wow, this is really just amazing. And there's 2,000 people lined up to get hugs. Okay. So she finishes this, and the hug part starts. So the first row goes, and then I'm in the second row. And these hugs are actually quite perfunctory, because 2,500 people into that. Okay, thank you. So it comes to me, and I give my hug, but it doesn't stop. It just goes on for a couple minutes. And I'm like going, what's happening? And she's talking to me in her dialect, and her translator's talking to me. And I'm going, wow, this is really a long time here. And I keep, okay. And then at the end of it, she gives me this bracelet, and she gestures, and she wants me to sit next to her. So I end up sitting next to her for the next really long period of time while she hugs all of these people. And she's talking to me the whole time. And it was like this incredible, it was like a very interesting experience. So after this, her people go, oh, that's extraordinary. She really doesn't do that, da, 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 da. And I said, you know, it'd be interesting. I'd love to have Alma come to Stanford. And she goes, she doesn't do that. And I go, what do you mean well, she won't, she doesn't do interviews, she doesn't do this type, she just does her work. I go, well, you need to ask her. So a few weeks later, I get a call and they go, Alma has agreed to do this. So she ends up coming to Stanford with her and I on the stage. And remember, she doesn't speak English, so she has a translator. So we spend the next hour and a half, and there are 2,000 people waiting to get hugged, also there. And it turns out to be the most fun, delightful conversation. And then at the end, I give Hama a hug. And it was really quite fun. And after this, her organization actually ends up giving us, my organization, a significant donation and thanks me. And her people tell me that she had a really an extraordinary experience and wanted to thank me. And actually now I'm invited to go to her ashram and actually speak at her ashram. So it's a very, so you should watch it, but it's an interesting, and Eckhart Tolle was quite fun too. So I'm really blessed because I get to do these things. So on the Alma end of things, I'll finish this by saying we had our Summer Research Institute, which I was mentioning to you. So this was actually prior to this event at Stanford with Alma, but it was after I had actually met her for this prolonged hug. So we have the Summer Research Institute, and at the end of it, we have a party, and the students were there, the faculty, and some of our benefactors. So I give a toast to thank everyone for their participation, et cetera, et cetera. So a senior scientist woman gets up, and she says, you know, I want to give a toast to Dr. Doty. I don't usually do this, as many of you know me here, but I just want to acknowledge his contribution to this field. And it was really a very generous toast. And so at the end of it, I felt compelled to give her a hug, right? So I give her a hug. So then the student then stands up, one of our students, and it's an interesting kid. He's from Sweden, I think, and he was a physics major who was switched over to do compassion research, which is a very bizarre thing, I think. But regardless, he does this. And he's also a poet. So throughout this whole week, he's been creating poems. So he says, well, Dr. Doty, I'd like to read this poem I wrote in dedication of this event. So I go, okay, great. So he does his poem, and you know, it was really sweet. And so I give him a hug. And I after the second hug, I said, you know, I almost feel like Alma. I said, I met her, and I feel like now I'm Alma-like. And then this senior scientist stands up, not the woman, but another senior scientist. He says, well, I want a hug too. So I give him a hug. There's 60 people at this event. Everyone lines up for a hug. No, I'm serious. I mean, it was the most bizarre, extraordinary. And what's amazing about this is, half were laughing incredibly, and the other half were crying. And it just went through this incredible line of people, and they would get their hug, but it shows you the power of a hug and this connection and having this connection. I mean, I got emails from so many of these people saying, I can't tell you how profound that was. And it's amazing, you know, how we don't appreciate the power that each of us has to bring to alleviate the suffering of another, to show care, compassion. You know, some people say, geez, there's so much suffering in the world. You know, I can't do anything. I'm only X, Y, or Z, right? And there's a African, I guess it's a myth or story, but there's a fire in the forest or in the jungle, and all the large animals are standing on the outside. And they're all watching the jungle burn. And they look up and they see a hummingbird. And the hummingbird is flying from a lake to the fire. Back and forth they watch it. And one of the animals says, why are you doing this? Why are you wasting? You can't possibly have, you the hummingbird says, that may be true, but I can only do what I can do. And each of us can only do what we can do, but each time you put a drop on that fire, it has the potential to ripple out further because you inspire others. Thank you.
Alright, so are we all getting a hug tonight?
If you would like.
Well, thank you for your presence tonight, and on behalf of the Buddhist Library and everyone here tonight, I'd like to thank Professor Doty. Thank you so much for your time. Also, I'd like to thank all the volunteers who helped out tonight. Andrew helped to set up the whole hall tonight at the back. He's at the back, and Marion, Susie, and Ming, and Ronnie. Daniel was looking after the video, so he will put this up on YouTube on the Buddhist Library channel, and I'll share it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again.
And also Peter, who is helping with giving the transport for